Ladies and gentlemen, we now resume the remaining session. I will request the moderator, Dr. Anil Salman, to kindly take over the remaining proceedings.
Welcome back, and now we have our next eminent speaker, and that is Dr. Usman Chohan. Dr. Usman Chohan is an international economist and academic who serves as Director of Economic Affairs and National Development at CAS. He is among the top 10 business authors out of 12,000 authors on the Social Science Research Network, which is the largest open repository of knowledge in the world. Dr. Usman will be talking about fiscal sustainability, finding the innovative solutions. Doctor.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. President IPRI, my esteemed colleagues in the panel, esteemed guests, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. What Sir Suleri said and what Sir Harun Sharif said gives you a great idea of the condition we are in. So I'm dancing around the subject in terms of innovative solutions. With the final conclusion of the presentation I'll give you right now is that the innovative solution is कि हम सबकी नीयत ठीक होनी चाहिए. It's a moral case. That is innovative. In the sense that in French you have two words for innovation, innovant, novateur. So it's not innovant as in moral case for niyat theek karna, but it's novateur because it's new in our space. And that is the basis for economics, because don't forget that economics was originally a branch of philosophy, right? And that's what matters here. But I will again circumambulate the subject to get to it. So, I'm not sure that the... Just going to request some technicals. So, why do you need fiscal sustainability? What is even the nature of the subject? And then a set of solutions that together help to work around it, with the caveat that you have niyat tiko. Data integration, talk a little bit of agriculture, a superannuation, sovereign wealth fund was already well mentioned, but I'm talking the nativist context, the power sector, parliamentary budget office. I can take questions about cryptocurrencies and other virtual assets in the Q&A, because that's a very large subject for me. So, and then the conclusion is the spirit of fiscal sustainability has to be there. Next slide, please. So, we're hitting a fiscal cliff, some people say. Don't worry, it's just a metaphorical cliff until you fall off the cliff. So, economic security is the basis of that. It's been very well covered by my predecessors. It's a sense of the social contract. So you take some revenue to spend something to create public value. It is the basis of a functioning society that has the state on top. So we presume that there is a state and it serves the people, and the people then contribute to bolster the state. And fiscal sustainability assumes that you have a long-term orientation. You cannot go from crisis to crisis, as was mentioned, 5% GDP, it overheats, then you sink, then you borrow. That's not a long-term way. It's jumping from crisis to crisis. It has deep psychological effects on us, and it also ruptures the social fabric. So that is a very serious consideration beyond just balance sheets. And it speaks to an intergenerational equity. In the audience, I perceive that the median age is about 30 or less. And so the justice that has to be done to you, as in me too, I'm 35, is that it's an inequity. This burden is being passed on to us. The can is being kicked down the road. And so we will suffer immensely as a generation preceding us subsides, we will have to carry that burden, and it doesn't get any easier. So this is what you should keep in mind if you're close to the median here of 30. Fiscal sustainability is also a question of the optimization of your endowment. So my grandmother, who is still alive, mashallah, says that Allah miyan ne sab kuch diya hua hai is mulk ko, and I said, it's more true back in your day. Ab abadi itni badh gayi hai, masle itne ho gaye hain. I wouldn't be so grandiose about that, although shukr karna chahiye. It isn't as true because the endowments aren't being used in the optimal manner to then produce themselves and reproduce themselves. So it becomes more difficult in terms of the endowments that we have. And so, as the title today says, only through fiscal sustainability can you arrive at the maximization of your potential, put simply. Next slide, please. Now, when you look at the architecture that is supposed to promote fiscal sustainability, you actually have a lot of things in Pakistan. You have a Financial Management Act. You have a State Bank Amendment Bill, but you have the State Bank, and the State Bank has run things quite professionally over the last 70 years. You have a PAC, a Public Accounts Committee. You have an Auditor General. You have a Muhtasab, an Ombudsman. You have enforcement agencies like NAB and FIA. You have FATF-related specific stipulations that have been put in. You have a lot of things. So on paper, if you were to talk to somebody who is studying, let's say he's doing a PhD in this subject as I did, you would say, well, on paper it looks pretty good. I mean, what's the deal? Well, that's where the niyat comes in. You can have a whole lot of bells and whistles, but if they're not working towards the goal without, as Sir Haroon said, the economics and politics and the politics and economics, all of this doesn't really work towards the final goal. Next slide, please. One thing I want to help build as a thesis for you is data integration. So, 220 million people should be an asset, but if you don't know what anybody is doing, suddenly it starts to seem like a liability. Why? Because you don't understand who is there doing what for what worth. That is the problem. The way to do it in the 21st century is to have an integration of what you are already collecting. There's no shortage of data being collected, although we need to create more detailed and comprehensive profiles which add the fiscal element to it. Now, work on this is already being done by NADRA, by the FBR and all, but it hasn't reached its full capacity. What I'm really talking about here is that you understand the people who navigate society with you. When you are a parent here, you tell your young children, "Bahar abhi mat jao, pata nahi kaun phir raha hai." Kyun nahi pata kaun phir raha hai? Because you don't know, so you live psychologically with a large shadow over society. Kyun nahi pata bahar kaun phir raha hai? Because everybody roams about doing their own thing, which has deep psychological impacts, and it impacts the fiscal element too, because you don't know who owes what to whom. And so you end up squeezing the people you can grab hold of easiest, which is the tankhadar or the industrialist. And it isn't fair. Because we don't really know 22 crore kya kar rahe hain. 22 crore is such an enormous number. So data integration is the first part. Next, please. Taxation is a tricky subject when it comes to agriculture. And I won't give specific recommendations on that, but the way that it is structured, put simply, I can go back to a paper from 1973, 1974, the problem of agricultural taxation in West Pakistan, and basically what they said then is what we need now. But in terms of employment, as was mentioned by Sir Saleri, it is the largest employer, but it isn't the most value added, and services is the most value added, but it has lesser employment. So agriculture needs to be looked at very carefully at the provincial and at the federal level. I will avoid, because this is an area where you really have to be a subject, so I'll avoid giving specific recommendations, but it's kind of a big spot where you aren't doing enough. Next slide, please. Superannuation and pension is one that's very interesting for me because, as was mentioned previously, we are borrowing to fund the pension liability. Think about how weird this is. You are a country that is so young, and yet you have a problem of old people. I can imagine an Eastern European country whose median age is now 55 would be worried about pensions. You're so young. and you have a pension problem for the small percent that is old. That is why you need to start thinking about structuring superannuation in this country. I know that, for example, federal employees or provincial employees of government do have things, and some other cooperatives do work around it, but the way that some countries have done it, the Provident Fund in Singapore, the superannuation system in Australia, you basically come up with a huge pile of money. In Australia, it's about $1 trillion plus that they have sitting there that is going to fund as their society ages. And they have a working, functioning system, so you can still take immigrants, etc. They don't necessarily need it, but they have it. And I want to offer options today. Superannuation structuring in the way that is done in countries where you have a provident fund that encompasses everyone requires the data integration that was mentioned earlier. But having us think about retirement, even when our median age is 30, is what we need to do, and there are digitalized ways of doing this. With one caveat. The caveat is that there's recent work been done by the Parliamentary Budget Office in Australia, which says, what if you didn't have this good system? And everybody did their own thing. The conclusions are that some people would be much better off. But that's true in Pakistan too. Some people are doing very well. The problem is overall, not planning for this in the future becomes a crisis. And so pension liability is the weirdest thing for a young country to have, but we have it. So working on that is a priority. Next slide, please. Sovereign wealth fund was adequately mentioned in terms of tapping pools of capital out there to fund investments here that offer a return that is grounded in well-structured contracts that are mutually beneficial. That was the thesis. An additional point to that is start to think about a sovereign wealth fund for Pakistan, underpinned by our research endowments, underpinned by our stuff. Sounds good in theory, but you actually have to do a lot of work to have a working sovereign wealth fund. This is a book that's coming out next year. I have 2 chapters, including one on sovereign wealth funds. That's why I'm saying that. So this is probably the area where the niyat theek hona is the most important, because the temptation to tap into that sovereign wealth fund is too great. So you need to have a lot of things working, which are the things that would be required for the overall system to work, so the chicken and egg game persists. Next slide, please. Power sector reforms, you hear a lot about this in the media. To me, power sector is very interesting because we have a parallel in Pakistan to what the United States has in healthcare. Every developed country has solved it, but for some reason America has this thing where they can't seem to get their head around healthcare. It's the most expensive. They spend the most money on it and they don't get good treatment. Many people are bankrupted by it. So somehow something came in the middle which threw a wrench in it and it doesn't work anymore. We have the same thing with power. Bijli farham karna koi itni badi science nahi hai. It's about 200 years old. But some reason we can't get our head around it, and we have circular debt and we have all these other issues that come with it. And there's a long list of things that can be done to it. My personal recommendation is going towards renewables, looking at the contracts that we have signed, and getting other things done in power. There's a long list of solutions that involve it, but for some reason we have to detach ourselves from the mindset that came with, for example, American healthcare, that they made it into a wicked problem. It isn't. Very simple. Power is, just so you must remember this, in economics, we talk about money as the key thing, but actually all economics is a claim to energy. Whether it is your labor power, whether it is the capital you deploy, the machines, energy is the primary aspect of economic life. What you're really talking around when you talk in economics is energy, including bijli, but not exclusively bijli. Next slide. Parliamentary budget offices. So this is my favorite. It's the area of my PhD. Imagine this. Any democracy has a parliament or a congress, and people who are elected based on votes that they've gotten, not based on their expertise on the budget. So you argue that if there was an independent office that was working on it, they would provide neutral, dispassionate, long-term oriented figures on the overall budget, as well as on specific issues that are requested by parliamentarians. Many countries have it. I've advised African countries on it. I've testified in parliaments on the reviews of it, testimony. And I've worked on it a lot, and I'm convinced that it is a very important solution. It's also risks being a tick mark. So, humne ji ye bhi idara bana diya hai. And just keep in mind that this institution is one that gets hammered so hard because the opposition, no matter who it is, they will strike at it, they're liars, they're this, they're that. So we also need a climate that is decent and conducive to independence and rigor, and we don't necessarily have that in the developing world. In one country, the parliamentary budget officer was indicted for corruption, or, that kind of thing, but it becomes quite sensitive because you're talking about the resources of a society, and everybody in parliament has a vested interest in shaping the narrative one way or the other. But if you can have the right environment, this is an institution that I would like to see in Pakistan. I've seen it everywhere in the world, and in testimony they ask, well, where are you? I'm in Pakistan. Do you have one of these? We don't have one of these. It's kind of silly. We should have one of these, but it has so many precursors that without those precursors, it will not work. It'll just be one other list in the list I showed you on the second slide, one other item, कि जी ये भी हमारे पास है, पर फिर आपका निज़ाम क्यों नहीं चल रहा? That's the point. So parliamentary budget offices, I'm a strong proponent, but I need to see a lot of things put in place for it to work. Next slide, please. So, institutional support is required. The bureaucracy has to be willing to give the data. All the ministries have to be ready to submit in the spirit of transparency as required. They require data. You live in a data-less society. Again, the point, कि कुछ पता नहीं कौन क्या कर रहा है, किधर कर रहा है. So you need a data-driven society. It requires protection in law. We have set an interesting precedent with the state bank being made independent as enshrined in law. So you've already opened the door for having this sort of thing, as long as you do it in the right spirit. In some countries, it's not so well protected by law, but it's defended by the culture. It requires freedom, so you have to be able to ask flana politician, flana ye banda ke ye mujhe chahiye, and azadi se main aapse ek azadana soch chahiye. And it requires experts. You need those hardcore accountants and economists. The biggest parliamentary budget office is in the United States. When it was built after Watergate in the 1970s, they actually had a very hard time, but today they have like 20, 30 experts just on healthcare. They have more than 200 people staffing it. But you can have very small institutions that still provide some value. The one in Australia is about 30 people. The one in Bangladesh, they have one. It's about 5 people in a basement. But you can start small and find your bearings and then work it out. But again, niyat theek honi chahiye. Next slide, please. If you want the system to work well, you can have all sorts of bells and whistles and you will come to nothing of it because the spirit of sustainability isn't there. I go back to Sir Soleri's point about the savings rate. Our savings rate is below 15%, which is similar to the United States. Yani ke aap America jaisa taka jamate hain. You have the hum bhi America hain, but you don't print the dollar. You don't have the world reserve currency. You cannot live off deficits like they do. But why do you save so little then? You have a mindset. Look at the people around you in society. कि कल का कुछ पता नहीं. कल का कुछ पता नहीं, लेकिन आप 10 बच्चे पैदा कर देते हैं. Each one. तो कल का कुछ पता नहीं is a mindset that is not conducive to savings, which is therefore not conducive to growth. The quality of growth, as mentioned by the 2 previous speakers, is true. If your definition of growth as it's manifested in society is Kia Sportage badi chal rahi hai Islamabad mein, that is not a representative of a productive society. And you don't have to be a laborer carrying bricks to the houses to be productive. Each of us has a role in being productive members of society. And when you produce like this, you keep some for the future. That is the root and the basis of fiscal sustainability. This is it's a mindset, a psychological basis for building aage kuch karna hai. Otherwise, keep bouncing from crisis to crisis. And at some point, you will have to make tougher decisions than the ones we're seeing today. Because the game is up. You can't keep living like this unless hum banda barna shuru kar dein. That is the moral case behind it. So don't do it just in letter and have more institutions. The most innovative thing I can offer you is the moral case for doing things right and thinking about the future and thinking about the generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chohan. Excellent points about fiscal sustainability, sovereign wealth, the parliamentary reforms, and the tagline, energy is the prime aspect of economy.